Mark Turner had seen it all before. The sleek, red Ferrari tearing down the streets of downtown Detroit was more than just a car. It was a flashing signal for trouble. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of the driver, a young black woman behind the wheel. Years on the force had conditioned his mind to jump to conclusions almost immediately. Black person, expensive car, late afternoon on the south side. It had to be drugs. No doubt. "Here we go again," he muttered under his breath, his fingers automatically flicking on the patrol lights. The siren blared as he weaved through traffic, closing in on the Ferrari. To him, this was routine. Pull her over, find the stash, make the arrest. Another easy day at work. Yet, something felt off about this one. He couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way she drove, with a calm, unhurried confidence. Or maybe it was the way she didn't flinch when he finally pulled up behind her at the light. In the Ferrari, Rachel Carter's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the flashing lights filled her rearview mirror. She knew this moment might come, had prepared herself for it. Being a black woman in a luxury car often came with an automatic side of suspicion, but today was different. Today, she wasn't just Rachel, the attorney. She was Rachel, the advocate for justice, on her way to fight for 3 young boys wrongfully ensnared in the criminal justice system. Her purpose was clear, her determination unwavering. With a calm breath, she signaled and pulled over to the curb. Her heart remained steady, even as her mind ran through the possibilities. Turner approached the car, one hand already resting on his holster. A reflex born more from his prejudices than necessity, but it spoke volumes about his mindset. He peered into the tinted window, his face set in hard lines. Rachel rolled it down, meeting his gaze with a calmness that caught him off guard. "License and registration," he barked, his voice weighted with authority. Silently, Rachel handed over the papers, her eyes never wavering from his. She knew better than to provoke the situation. In her line of work, she had seen how quickly things could spiral out of control. Especially with someone like Turner, whose worldview was clouded by bias. Turner looked at her license, then back at her. "What are you doing in this area?" The question was dripping with accusation, his tone suggesting she had no business being there, let alone driving such a car. "I'm here for work," Rachel replied, her voice measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" His stare hardened. Work? What kind of business could someone like her possibly have here? Driving a car like that? The pieces didn't fit in his mind. Couldn't fit, because he wasn't willing to see past the narrow scope of his assumptions. "Step out of the car," he ordered, convinced now that this wasn't just a regular traffic stop. The luxury car, her poised demeanor, everything about her set off red flags in his head. With a quiet sigh, Rachel complied. She opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, standing tall, her back straight, radiating the same calm composure that had earned her respect in courtrooms across the country. But this wasn't a courtroom, and Turner wasn't a judge. He was the law, or rather, his own twisted version of it. His eyes swept over the Ferrari, scanning it as though searching for something, anything that would justify the suspicion gnawing at him. "I'm searching the car," he announced, not waiting for her consent. Rachel watched, her anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She knew her rights, knew this search was illegal, but she also knew this wasn't the time to fight. This was just the beginning of something larger. She let him rummage through her belongings, biting back the urge to challenge him as he carelessly rifled through the car. His frustration grew with every second he found nothing. Turner slammed the trunk shut with force, his irritation palpable. He was certain there was something, there had to be. But no matter how hard he looked, there was nothing. His mind raced, searching for another explanation, one that wouldn't require him to reconsider the snap judgments he had already made. And when he couldn't find one, he reached for his last resort, the handcuffs. "You're coming with me," he said coldly, devoid of the satisfaction that usually accompanied these moments. He reached for her wrists, roughly pulling her hands behind her back. Rachel's eyes widened just slightly, her mind racing through the implications. "On what grounds?" she demanded, but her question was met with silence. The metal cuffs dug into her wrists, and she flinched as he cinched them tighter. Turner swung open the back door of the patrol car and shoved her inside, the door slamming shut with a resounding thud that echoed down the quiet street. Rachel stared out the window, her heart racing, a storm of disbelief and simmering rage roiling inside her. As Turner settled into the driver's seat, he cast a glance at her in the rearview mirror. In his mind, he'd done the right thing. He'd seen this all before. As the car pulled into the station lot, his mind buzzed with self-righteous certainty. He knew that look, the attitude. He'd seen it 1,000 times. It wasn't just about the car or the confident way she carried herself. It was the whole package, a defiant air wrapped up in a sleek, high-end vehicle. To him, it screamed trouble, something rotten beneath the surface. He yanked the car into park and climbed out, swinging open the door with enough force to rattle the frame. Rachel remained quiet, her composure unbroken, despite the rough handling. Turner's hand clamped down on her arm as he dragged her from the car, his grip unyielding. The brisk New York air stung her face, though it wasn't the chill that made her skin prickle. It was the bitter realization that she was about to face the very system she had spent years fighting, this time on the wrong side. He hustled her through the station doors, his pace quick, his thoughts laser-focused on the task at hand. The harsh fluorescent lights cast a stark glow on the worn linoleum floors as they entered. The station buzzed with the usual activity, phones ringing, officers talking in low tones, the quiet hum of a place that never quite rested. Yet no one gave them a second glance. To the officers around them, this was routine. Just another arrest, another suspect. Rachel's reputation as a prominent lawyer meant little in this place, if it meant anything at all. They reached the interrogation room, a cramped, stark box of a space, its walls bare, save for a single table in the center. Turner shoved her into a chair, the cuffs still biting into her wrists. The room smelled faintly of bleach, mixed with the stale bitterness of old coffee. It was the kind of place designed to strip a person down, make them feel small, insignificant. But Rachel was neither small nor insignificant. Turner leaned over the table, his hands splayed flat on the cold metal, his face inches from hers. "You think you're clever, huh?" he sneered. "Cruising around in that fancy car, acting like you're better than the rest of us. But I see right through you." His words dripped with disdain, his voice hardened by years of cynicism and unchecked authority. Rachel didn't waver, her eyes locked onto his with a calm that had won her countless battles in the courtroom. "I have nothing to hide, officer," she said evenly, her voice as measured as it always was when she was dismantling a prosecutor's case. "You're making a mistake." He slammed his hand against the table, the sharp sound ricocheting off the walls. "Mistake? The only mistake here is you thinking you can fool me." His tone was bitter, every word laced with the weariness of someone who had seen too much and let it poison his soul. "You're a drug dealer," he spat, as if saying it out loud made it fact. "Just because you've got a law degree, you think you're untouchable. Not in my town." Rachel remained still, her voice steady. You have no evidence. This arrest is unlawful, and you know it." Turner's jaw clenched, his frustration barely concealed. "I don't need evidence," he hissed. "I've got years of experience, and I know exactly what you are." But Rachel knew that experience and suspicion weren't enough. Not in the real world, not in court. She had spent her career fighting with facts, truth, and the sharpness of the law. Those were the real weapons. "If you're so sure, then why are we still here? Why don't you book me and let a judge decide?" For a fleeting second, uncertainty flickered across his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by that same rigid determination. He pushed away from the table, pacing the small room, his anger swelling. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was meant to break, to fold under the weight of his authority. Instead, she sat there, calm, collected, as if she were the one in control. He spun back toward her, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You're not walking away from this," he warned. "I'll find something. And when I do, you'll regret ever setting foot in New York." The door creaked open, and another officer stepped in, clipboard in hand, his demeanor detached, almost bored. He glanced between Turner and Rachel, indifferent. "Paperwork's ready for processing," he said, as though it was just another day, just another formality. Turner gave a stiff nod, his grip tightening on the illusion of control that was slipping through his fingers. "All right, let's get her booked." With a sharp tug, Rachel was hauled to her feet, the cold metal of the cuffs digging into her skin as she was led from the interrogation room into the bustling booking area. The station buzzed with life, officers moving about in a blur of uniforms, but now some heads turned. Whispers followed her as she passed by, quiet, curious. A few recognized her, most just saw another person in handcuffs. Rachel barely noticed the stares. Her mind was already racing, plotting her next move. They sat her down in front of the booking desk, where a tired officer slumped behind the computer, his eyes glazed with the fatigue of a long shift. "Name?" he asked, barely lifting his head. "Rachel Carter," she replied, her voice steady as ever. The officer's fingers hovered over the keys. For a moment, he froze. His eyes flicked up at her, then quickly darted to Turner, who stood just a few feet away, arms folded, his face etched with satisfaction. The officer's expression shifted. Just a trace of unease crossed his face. He glanced back at the screen and resumed typing. The rhythmic clack of the keys, the only sound in the thickening tension. Word of her arrest began to spread beyond the station's walls. Calls were made, messages sent. It wasn't long before the entire city's legal community knew Rachel Carter had been arrested. And not just arrested, dragged in like a common criminal, without a shred of evidence or a valid reason. The reaction was swift and intense. As the sun began to set over Detroit, the first wave of support had already gathered. Lawyers, activists, and community leaders descended upon the police station, demanding answers, demanding her release. Outside, the crowd grew, voices rising in fury and disbelief. Protest signs appeared, and chants began to echo through the cooling evening air, thickening the tension that now hung like a storm cloud over the station. Inside, Turner could feel the pressure mounting. He was summoned to the chief's office, where the atmosphere was far from supportive. The chief, a weathered veteran of the force, wasted no time with pleasantries. "Do you even realize who you just arrested?" the chief asked, his voice low but laced with a severity that made Turner's stomach tighten. Turner straightened his posture, though his confidence wavered for the first time. "She's a drug dealer, sir," he said, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears now. The chief's gaze sharpened, narrowing in disbelief. She's a high-profile civil rights attorney with connections that reach far beyond this city. You've just opened a can of worms that might blow up in our faces. The weight of the chief's words hit Turner like a freight train. The realization began to settle in, heavy and uncomfortable. He had made a grave mistake. Earlier, though, as he pulled his patrol car into the station's lot, his mind was buzzing with his usual self-justifications. He knew the type. He'd seen it so many times before. The flashy car, the poised demeanor. To him, it all screamed deceit. He had pegged Rachel Carter as trouble the moment he saw her. It wasn't just the car or the way she held herself with that unwavering confidence. It was the whole package, wrapped up in privilege and defiance. He parked and stepped out, yanking the back door open with a force that rattled the hinges. Rachel remained quiet, her composure solid, despite the rough treatment. Turner grabbed her arm, his grip firm as he pulled her from the car. The biting Detroit wind whipped against her face, but the cold wasn't what chilled her. It was the bitter realization that, despite everything she had fought for, she was now trapped in the very system she'd spent her career challenging, this time as a victim. Turner dragged her through the front entrance of the station, his pace quick, his thoughts single-minded. Overhead, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh, almost clinical glow on the old linoleum floors. The station hummed with its usual activity, phones ringing, officers murmuring to one another, the steady hum of a place that never really stopped. No one paid much attention to the scene unfolding in front of them. It was just another arrest, just another body in cuffs. That Rachel was a well-known lawyer didn't seem to matter, or maybe it hadn't even registered. They led her to a cramped interrogation room, the walls bare and bleak, save for a single table and 2 chairs. Turner shoved her into a chair, the cuffs still biting into her wrists. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee, a place designed to strip away dignity, to make people feel small. But Rachel was anything but small. She refused to shrink. Turner leaned over the table, his hands planted flat on its surface, his face only inches from hers. His voice was sharp with disdain. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered, his eyes full of contempt. "Cruising around in that flashy car like you're above everyone else. But I see right through you." Turner's voice dripped with disdain as he leveled his gaze at her. Rachel didn't blink, meeting his eyes with a calm steadiness that had disarmed countless prosecutors in the courtroom. "I've got nothing to hide, officer," she replied, her voice cool and measured, as if she were delivering a closing argument. "You're making a mistake." The tension in the room thickened as Turner slammed his hand against the table. The sharp crack echoed off the sterile walls. "A mistake? No. The only mistake here is you thinking you can fool me." His words were bitter, laced with the frustration of a man who'd long seen the worst in people, letting it corrode whatever empathy he had left. "You're a drug dealer, plain and simple, and being a lawyer won't protect you. Not in my city." Rachel's expression didn't waver. "You don't have any proof. This is an illegal arrest, and you know it." Turner's jaw clenched, his fury barely contained. "I don't need proof. I've been doing this long enough to know exactly who you are." His words were like a verdict handed down without a trial. But Rachel wasn't fazed. She knew the truth wasn't on his side. "If that's true, why are we still here? Just process me and let a judge decide." For a fleeting second, doubt flickered in Turner's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. His resolve hardened, and he began pacing the small room, his frustration mounting. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was meant to break down, to crack under the weight of his accusations. But instead, she sat there, composed. as though it was him on trial, not her. He turned back toward her, his voice dropping into a growl. "You're not walking away from this. I'll find something. And when I do, you'll wish you'd never set foot in New York." The door creaked open, cutting through the charged silence. Another officer stepped in, clipboard in hand. He barely looked at Rachel, instead glancing between her and Turner. "Paperwork's ready for booking," he said flatly, as if this were just another mundane task in his day. Turner nodded, the grip on his control tightening once more. "Good. Let's get her processed." Rachel was pulled to her feet, the cold steel of the handcuffs digging into her wrists as they led her out of the interrogation room and into the buzz of the precinct. Eyes followed her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. But Rachel didn't care about the whispers. She had a bigger fight ahead. They seated her in front of the booking desk, where an officer with tired eyes started typing up her information. "Name?" he asked, not bothering to look up. "Rachel Carter," she answered, her tone steady and unshaken. The officer's fingers hovered over the keys, and then he paused, recognition dawning on his face. He lifted his eyes to meet hers, then cast a quick glance at Turner, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, watching with a grim satisfaction. Something shifted in the officer's expression, perhaps discomfort or maybe doubt. But he said nothing, returning to his work. The sound of clacking keys filled the air, an uncomfortable soundtrack to the slow unraveling of what should never have been. As the booking process dragged on, news of Rachel's arrest spread beyond the station. Phone calls were made, emails fired off. Before long, the legal community across the city was buzzing with outrage. Word traveled fast. Rachel Carter, one of the most respected human rights attorneys in the state, had been hauled in like a petty criminal, without cause or evidence. By the time the sun dipped below the Manhattan skyline, the first wave of supporters had already descended on the station. Lawyers, civil rights advocates, community leaders, they gathered at the entrance, demanding her release, demanding justice. Outside, the crowd swelled. Voices rang out in anger, signs were lifted high, and the air crackled with tension. Inside, Turner could feel the pressure building. His confidence, which had been unshakable just hours earlier, now began to waver. He was summoned to his superior's office, a place where he was accustomed to being commended, not questioned. The captain, a gruff man with decades of experience, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Do you have any idea who you just arrested?" His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that made Turner's stomach twist. Turner stood straighter, but for the first time his confidence faltered. "She's a drug dealer, Chief," Turner muttered, though the words rang hollow even in his own ears. The chief's gaze sharpened, his face hardening. "She's a well-known civil rights attorney with ties that stretch far beyond this city. You've opened a Pandora's box we may never be able to close." The full weight of his actions bore down on Turner, his chest tightening as guilt gnawed at him like a relentless force. Walking out of the chief's office, Turner could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. The precinct buzzed with an uneasy energy since Rachel's arrival, officers moving with purpose, but their glances betrayed discomfort. Word of Rachel Carter's arrest had spread like wildfire, sweeping across every corner of Detroit and beyond. It wasn't just the local community stirring. Attorneys, activists, even high-profile politicians were starting to pay attention. Across the city, phones rang in law offices. Texts and emails zipped through the devices of powerful figures, and social media was ablaze with the news. Rachel Carter, once synonymous with justice, a relentless advocate for the voiceless, was now at the heart of a brewing storm. Those who had long admired her work, who had watched her defend the marginalized, were rising in her defense. The mayor, seasoned in navigating political maelstroms, could feel the heat closing in. This situation was spiraling out of control, and the pressure to take action was mounting fast. He knew the public eye was fixed on every move, not just locally, but nationally, with the media hungry for the next headline. Outside the police station, the crowd had swelled, growing larger with every passing hour. What had started as a small gathering of supporters had become a full-blown protest. Signs demanding justice for Rachel, calls to end racial profiling, and the powerful chants of Black Lives Matter reverberated through the air. The energy was thick with a mix of anger and defiance, a force that refused to be ignored. Inside the holding cell, Rachel could hear the muffled roar of the crowd, distant but comforting. It gave her a bittersweet sense of strength. She knew they weren't just out there for her. They stood for every person wronged by a system that was supposed to safeguard them. This wasn't just her fight. It was theirs, too. Seated on the cold, hard bench, Rachel held her posture steady, unyielding. She was tired, but her resolve remained unbroken. The rhythmic sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway. The door creaked open, and in walked a familiar face, one of her closest allies, a fellow attorney who had fought alongside her in countless battles. His expression was a mix of concern and respect. "They've got nothing on you, Rachel," he said, stepping into the cell, his voice quiet but firm. "This is going to backfire on them. We've already got the team prepping the lawsuit. This is a fight they won't forget." Rachel allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The wheels had been set in motion. Her legal team worked with precision, swiftly filing a lawsuit against the Detroit Police Department for racial profiling and wrongful arrest. The battle would quickly capture the nation's attention. News outlets picked up the story, and soon Rachel's name and face were splashed across every major news network, every headline. When the heavy metallic door slammed shut behind her, Rachel Carter stepped out of the police station into the cool evening air. The once tumultuous crowd quieted to a tense silence as they caught sight of her. It was a silence brimming with anticipation, every gaze fixed on her, waiting, watching. They all knew this wasn't the end, far from it. Her release was merely the beginning of a much larger war for justice. Rachel paused at the top of the steps, surveying the crowd below. These weren't just protesters, they were witnesses to the very injustice that had brought her here. She took a deep breath, her mind already racing through the steps ahead, mapping out the moves that would shape the legal battle now unfolding. "Thank you for your support," Rachel's voice rang out, strong and clear in the evening air. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every single person who's been wronged by a system meant to protect them. The fight for justice isn't over. It's only just begun." The crowd erupted, their voices rising in a powerful wave of unity and determination. Signs were lifted higher, and chants of "Justice for Rachel" grew louder, filling the air with a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel knew this moment would reverberate throughout the city, shaking the foundations of power, sending tremors into the offices of those who believed they were untouchable, and they had every reason to be on edge. The pressure was building fast, and it wouldn't be long before everything reached a tipping point. As Rachel navigated through the bustling crowd, her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from her close friend and colleague Emily lit up the screen. "We've got something. Call me ASAP." Rachel's heart raced. She recognized the urgency behind Emily's words. This wasn't just some small break. It was monumental, something that could shift the entire landscape. Sliding into her car, Rachel's fingers trembled with the lingering adrenaline as she quickly dialed Emily's number. "Rachel." Emily's voice crackled through the line, brimming with urgency, barely masking her excitement. "You won't believe this. We've been sent an anonymous package, a pile of documents that turns everything on its head. It's about those kids. And Turner. It's way worse than we ever thought." Rachel's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her mind racing as Emily continued. "The documents show a full-blown conspiracy. They framed those boys, Rachel. Turner and a group of officers planted evidence, coerced witnesses, even faked reports. And it doesn't stop there. This implicates people higher up the chain. It goes all the way to the top of the department." Rachel felt her breath catch. She had suspected corruption from the beginning. Her gut had told her so. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. "Emily," she asked, her voice tight, "are you sure? Are these documents legit?" "No doubt about it," Emily replied without hesitation. "I've combed through them myself. And there's more. Recordings. Actual conversations between Turner and his team discussing how they were going to set those boys up. Rachel, this is the smoking gun." Rachel's thoughts spiraled as she processed the magnitude of the situation. These documents didn't just confirm her suspicions. They were a direct path to dismantling a web of corruption that had choked the department for years. But this wasn't going to be easy. Going after these people meant challenging a system backed by powerful figures, and it would put everything at risk. "All right," Rachel finally said, her voice steady, her resolve hardening. "We need to act quickly. We'll build the case, but we're also taking this public. The media has to hear about this. Everyone does. This isn't just about those kids anymore. It's about exposing the entire corrupt system." Emily agreed, and the call ended with a shared understanding of the monumental task ahead. Rachel sat quietly in her car for a moment longer, her mind weaving through strategies and the enormity of what lay before her. This wasn't just a fight for a verdict. It was a fight to tear down a structure of lies and deceit that had sheltered the powerful for far too long. And Rachel was ready for it. The next morning, the news broke like a wildfire tearing through Detroit. Headlines screamed of corruption, conspiracy, and betrayal. Explosive evidence unveiled in police scandal. Officers framed innocent youths. The story spread like a storm across social media, with the hashtag #JusticeForRachel surging nationwide. Her legal team's interviews played on every major news channel, and the anonymous documents were thrust into the public eye for all to see. The city erupted. Protests grew larger by the hour, the voices of the people rising louder, demanding not just justice for Rachel, but for every person wronged by the system that had finally been exposed. The heat on the mayor and the police chief became unbearable. They could no longer turn a blind eye to the calls for accountability. Inside her office, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and the soft glow of her computer, Rachel felt the weight of the fight ahead settle on her shoulders. This was the moment she had worked her entire career for, the culmination of years of dedication and belief in justice. But for the first time, she could feel the tide turning in her favor. She inhaled deeply, steeling herself as she turned back to the files on her desk. Each case file, every document, was a weapon in her battle. Every fact needed to be airtight because what lay ahead wasn't just a trial. It was a war for the very soul of the city. The anonymous documents that had landed in her hands had shifted everything. They weren't just evidence of the corruption she had long suspected. They were a blueprint for the systemic rot that ran deep within the Detroit Police Department. Rachel knew this fight would come at a cost, but she was prepared to pay it. The decision to go public wasn't taken lightly. Rachel and her team were well aware of the dangers: retaliation, smear campaigns, and the possibility that crucial evidence could be tampered with or outright destroyed. Yet, hiding the truth was no longer an option. The public deserved to know, and the media would be their strongest weapon. Once the evidence was released, Rachel's legal team moved swiftly, filing a lawsuit against the Detroit Police Department. The case was headed for trial, and the courtroom was set to become the arena for a battle that would not only determine the fate of those involved, but might reshape the future of law enforcement in the city. The days leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of activity and intense planning. Rachel's office transformed into a command center, her team burning the midnight oil to ensure every aspect of their case was flawless. Every shred of evidence needed to be unassailable, every argument honed with precision. They knew the defense would be ruthless, throwing everything they had to undermine their credibility. But Rachel's team was prepared for the fight. Finally, the morning of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed, a quiet hum of anticipation filling the air. Every eye was fixed on Rachel Carter as she stood tall, her presence commanding the room. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the unveiling of the evidence that could topple an entire system. For weeks, the trial had been the talk of the city, whispers of corruption and injustice weaving through every conversation. But now, with the jury settled and the judge watching over the proceedings, the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on everyone like a heavy fog. Rachel's hand hovered over the stack of files, her fingers grazing the papers that contained the truth. It was the kind of truth that didn't just bruise, it shattered. For months, she and her team had combed through every detail, every witness statement, every scrap of evidence that could expose the dark underbelly of the Detroit Police Department. And today, the world would see what they'd uncovered. She cleared her throat, her voice steady, yet filled with a controlled fire that only comes from the righteous pursuit of justice. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we present today is undeniable proof that the men and women sworn to protect this city have been complicit in a network of deceit and corruption. We have audio recordings that will show, without question, how innocent lives were framed to protect those in power. A wave of tension rippled through the crowd. Rachel opened the file and handed a small device to the bailiff. A single click, and the courtroom filled with voices. Low, calculating, conspiring. Mark Turner's voice was unmistakable, as clear as if he were speaking in the room at that very moment. His words, once hidden in the shadows, now laid bare for the world to hear. Planted in the glove compartment. Nobody's going to question it if we find it there. These punks don't stand a chance in my town. The room fell into a stunned silence. The jurors shifted in their seats, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. Rachel paused, letting the gravity of the words settle. There was no rushing this moment. The truth needed to sink in, to take root in the minds of everyone present. Mark sat at the defense table, his eyes glued to the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The weight of the evidence was too heavy, the guilt too suffocating. He could feel the stares boring into him, the judgment hanging thick in the air. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he clenched his fists, trying to hold on to whatever semblance of control he had left. But inside, the walls were crumbling. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had believed, no, convinced himself, that he was doing the right thing, that his actions were for the greater good, protecting the city, keeping the streets clean. But now, as his own voice echoed in the courtroom, He realized just how deep the lies ran. He wasn't a protector. He was a pawn in a much bigger game. Rachel continued, her voice unwavering. This isn't just about Officer Turner. This is about a culture of corruption that has been allowed to thrive. It goes beyond the men sitting in this courtroom. It reaches into the highest levels of law enforcement, and it has to stop. Just then, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A man in uniform stepped forward, his presence causing a ripple of recognition among the spectators. Captain James Harrison, a man known for his integrity, a rare commodity in a department riddled with dishonesty, took the stand. His expression was grave, as if the burden of truth weighed on him as much as the secrets he was about to reveal. Captain Harrison, Rachel said, addressing him with the respect his reputation had earned, can you confirm the authenticity of these recordings? Harrison nodded solemnly. I can. I've been conducting my own investigation for months. These recordings are just the tip of the iceberg. What we're dealing with is a coordinated effort by high-ranking officials to manipulate crime statistics and frame innocent people. Officer Turner was one of many caught in this web. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the magnitude of Harrison's words sinking in. This wasn't just a case of one bad cop. This was systemic rot, and Harrison had just confirmed it in front of everyone. Mark sat frozen in his chair, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it, the moment he had dreaded, but also, in some strange way, needed. The weight of it all, the lies, the betrayals, the guilt, was unbearable. He couldn't keep carrying it. Not anymore. Slowly, he stood, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The prosecutor glanced at him, confused, but Mark didn't wait for permission. His voice cracked as he began to speak. It's true, he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Everything they've said is true. I did what they told me to do. I planted evidence. I framed those kids because I was told that's what needed to be done. But I wasn't acting alone. His gaze turned toward the back of the courtroom, where a row of senior officials sat, their faces pale and rigid. I was following orders from people higher up, people who told me this was how we kept control. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, and gasps filled the air. The judge slammed his gavel, calling for order, but it was clear the tide had turned. Mark's confession wasn't just about his own guilt. It was about tearing down the entire corrupt system that had allowed him to act with impunity. As the gavel echoed through the courtroom, Mark sank back into his chair, defeated yet strangely relieved. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. The truth had finally been spoken, and the city would never be the same again. It was Rachel's moment to address the court, and she took it with the gravitas of someone who knew exactly how much weight her words carried. Rising from her seat, every movement was deliberate, as if the world slowed to watch her. Her presence was undeniable, commanding the attention of the jury, the spectators, and even the judge who had presided over so many cases before. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice calm but steady, carrying the force of her conviction. This trial has revealed something that many of us have known, but far too few have been willing to confront. We've seen clear evidence that our justice system, the very foundation of our society, has been twisted by those who would exploit it for their own gain. Her gaze traveled across the room, making each person feel the weight of the truth in her words. The corruption we've uncovered doesn't just destroy lives. It destroys the trust we're supposed to have in those who protect and serve. She paused for a moment, letting her words settle. The room was silent, the tension almost tangible as people leaned in, drawn by the gravity of her speech. When she spoke again, her tone softened, but the resolve behind her words remained fierce. But this trial is about more than just punishment for those who have abused their power. It's about restoring faith in the rule of law. It's about making sure that our justice system works for everyone, not just the privileged few. It's about sending a clear message that we will not stand by, while those in power oppress the vulnerable. Justice must not only be done, it must be seen, felt, and trusted. Rachel's words carried a quiet power, the kind that comes from knowing the fight is far from over, but believing in the possibility of change. Her eyes flicked briefly to Mark Turner, seated at the defense table, and their gazes met for a brief, charged moment. In his eyes, she saw the exhaustion, the regret, and perhaps even the beginnings of understanding, an acknowledgement that had been so long in the making. As Rachel took her seat, the judge called for closing statements. The defense's argument was a hollow formality, their earlier confidence deflated after Mark's own confession had exposed the truth. It was clear that the tide had turned, and everyone in the room felt it. The jury deliberated for what seemed like an eternity, the weight of their responsibility pressing down on them. When the foreman finally stood, the room held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs, and then the faint sound of scattered applause, growing louder as the reality of the verdict sank in. Justice had been served, but it was a bittersweet victory. The damage caused by years of corruption and injustice couldn't be undone with a single verdict. Yet, it was a step in the right direction, a first step toward reclaiming the integrity of the system. As the judge read the sentences, the guilty parties were led away in handcuffs, their faces blank with resignation. Turner was the last to leave the courtroom. His steps were slow, heavy with the burden of the choices that had led him to this point. Before exiting, he paused, turning to face the room one last time. His eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the faces that had watched his fall from grace. And then, with a deep, sorrowful bow, he acknowledged the weight of his guilt. The gesture, more than any words, spoke of a man who understood he could never undo the harm he had caused. The courtroom watched in silence as Turner was escorted away, the heavy door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the chamber. It was over. In the days that followed, Rachel found herself in the eye of a media storm. News outlets hailed the trial as a landmark moment in the fight against systemic corruption and racial injustice. Her phone rang endlessly, letters of support piled on her desk, and offers began to pour in. Opportunities to take her fight for justice to a national stage. One particular offer stood out. An invitation from a prominent human rights organization to lead a nationwide initiative on police reform. It was the kind of platform that would allow Rachel to address the very issues she had spent her career battling, but on a far grander scale than she had ever imagined. Sitting in her office, the letter in front of her, Rachel felt the weight of the decision looming. This was a chance to make a difference across the country, to influence policies that could change countless lives. But as she thought about the opportunity, her mind drifted back to Detroit, the city that had been her battleground for so long. It was here, in these streets and courtrooms, that she had fought some of the most important battles of her life. The trial had sparked the beginning of change. New policies were being discussed, committees formed to ensure accountability, and a sense of hope, tentative but real, was beginning to take root. The city was starting to heal, but the wounds were still fresh. Could she really leave now, when the work was far from finished? The answer didn't come in a flash of clarity, but in the quiet reflection of everything she had been through. The fight for justice wasn't confined to one courtroom or one city. It was bigger than that, and if she had the chance to push for change on a broader scale, then she had a duty to seize it. Yet, Detroit would always be a part of her. The decision was made. She would take the role, but she wouldn't turn her back on Detroit. She would ensure that the momentum she had built would continue. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But she also knew she couldn't abandon Detroit. The city was in her blood, and its people were her people. Rachel made her decision. She would accept the role, but she would do so on her terms. She would ensure that the progress made in Detroit would continue, that the reforms would be implemented, and that the city would not be left behind. She would divide her time, staying connected to the grassroots work in Detroit while pushing for broader reforms on the national stage. As word of her decision spread, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Her new role was announced, and it was clear that her influence would now extend far beyond the city that had been her battleground. But Detroit was where her heart was, and she returned often, overseeing the implementation of the reforms she had fought so hard for. It was during one of these visits that she received an unexpected request, a meeting with Mark Turner. The prison visiting room was a bleak, sterile space, its white walls and harsh fluorescent lights offering no comfort, no warmth. The air was thick with unspoken words, a heavy silence that hung between Rachel and Mark Turner as they sat across from one another. The table separating them felt more like a chasm, a gulf of guilt, pain, and broken lives that neither could easily cross. Mark looked older than his years, the burden of his actions etched deeply into the lines on his face. His once sharp, authoritative demeanor was gone, replaced by a man weighed down by regret. His eyes, dull and tired, stared at the table as if the words he was about to speak could hardly bear the weight of their own meaning. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, hesitant, each word like a stone he struggled to lift. "I wanted to see you," he began slowly, his gaze finally rising to meet hers. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I've never told anyone." Rachel's face remained unreadable, her eyes calm but attentive. She said nothing, letting the silence encourage him to continue. Mark took a breath, and for a moment it seemed as though the memories weighed him down even more. "Years ago," he said, his voice low, "I was engaged. Her name was Emma. She was the love of my life." His voice faltered, and for the briefest moment, Rachel saw a flicker of the man he once was. A man who had loved deeply and had been utterly destroyed by his loss. "We were supposed to get married," Mark continued, his eyes clouding over as he was transported back to that fateful time. "Just a few days before the wedding, she was killed by a black man." He spat the words, the bitterness still clinging to them after all these years. "It was a senseless act, a robbery gone wrong. He took her from me, and I—" His voice broke, but he quickly composed himself, forcing out the next words. "I couldn't cope. I didn't know how to deal with the grief, the anger. It festered inside me, twisted everything. I carried that hatred into my work, and I let it consume me." Rachel didn't react, though she could feel the weight of his words. She understood the devastation of loss, the rawness of grief. But even as she sympathized with his pain, she knew it didn't justify what had come after. It didn't explain the choices he had made or the lives he had destroyed. Mark was a man shattered by tragedy, but he had let that tragedy rot into something far darker, something that had cost others their freedom, their dignity, and in some cases, their lives. Mark swallowed, the words now tumbling out of him, the admission a long time coming. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought that by being harder, by coming down on them, I was avenging her. I convinced myself that I was protecting the city, but all I was doing was feeding the poison inside me. I couldn't see it then. I couldn't see how wrong I was. But now I know. Rachel sat back, her gaze unyielding. She could see the torment in Mark's eyes, the conflict that had raged within him for years, but there was something more he needed to understand, something more she had told him once before. Mark, you weren't just acting on your own misguided anger. Her voice was steady, with an edge that hinted at the gravity of what she was about to remind him. You were being used. You were a pawn in a much bigger game, one played by people far above you, manipulating your grief, your hatred, for their own political gain. Mark stiffened slightly, the old resentment flaring for a moment. He had heard this before, back when Rachel first revealed the truth to him, before the trial. But even now it stung. He had prided himself on being a man of action, someone who took control. The thought that he had been nothing more than a tool in the hands of corrupt officials, men who had exploited his pain to maintain their grip on power, had gnawed at him since Rachel's first revelation. It was her words back then that had begun to unravel everything he thought he knew. Before the trial, Rachel had confronted him, laying out the truth with clinical precision. She had shown him the files, the documents, and the evidence of a web of corruption that went far beyond his own actions. High-ranking officials, desperate to maintain their stranglehold on the city, had preyed on men like Mark, using their personal tragedies to enforce a harsh system of control. They had encouraged the unlawful arrests, the racial profiling, the planting of evidence, all under the guise of keeping the streets safe. You weren't the only one, Rachel had told him in that cold, darkened room before the trial. You were one of many officers manipulated into doing their dirty work, and they let you take the fall when it all came crumbling down. They don't care about you, Mark. They never did. That revelation had broken something in him. For the first time, Mark had seen his role in the bigger picture, understood that he wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a cog in a machine far more insidious than he had imagined. That was when he had agreed to testify, to reveal the truth in court. It hadn't just been guilt that pushed him to confess. It had been the anger at being used, manipulated like a puppet on a string. Now, in this prison room, he stared at Rachel, the weight of her words settling on him once again. I didn't want to believe it, he muttered. But when you showed me, when I saw what they had done, how they'd twisted everything, I knew I couldn't keep quiet. I had to confess. I had to do something, even if it was too late. Rachel nodded, her face still calm but with a trace of compassion. It's never too late to start making things right, Mark. But this can't end with your confession. There are more people involved, more lives at stake. If you really want to make amends, you need to help expose the rest of them. Mark sat in silence for a long moment, the enormity of what she was asking sinking in. He had already destroyed his career, his reputation. But now, Rachel was asking him to take the next step, to help bring down the rest of the system, to expose the corruption that still thrived in the shadows. I don't know if I can fix this, Mark finally said, his voice hollow. But if there's a way, If there's any chance I can help stop them, then I'll do it. Rachel's eyes softened, just for a moment. We start by going after those higher up. You know the names, the deals. We'll make sure every piece of information gets out. Mark nodded slowly, the weight of his decision settling over him like a cloak. He had lived for too long in the darkness, but now, maybe, there was a way to redeem something, even if just a piece of his soul. As Rachel stood to leave, she glanced back one last time. We can't undo the past, Mark, but we can make sure the future is different. And with that, the door closed behind her, leaving Mark alone with the ghosts of his past and the uncertain path that lay ahead. Rachel Carter's journey was powerful, from the tough streets of Detroit to becoming a symbol of justice and reform. Her fight wasn't just about winning in court. It was about battling deep-rooted corruption while staying true to her humanity. She showed us that resilience and standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, is the key to real change. Turner, on the other hand, reminds us that while our past shapes us, it doesn't define us. His search for redemption proves it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and strive for better. What did you think of their story? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation going.